In the winter of 1922, deep in the coal-rich hills of Kentucky, an entire crew of miners vanished underground, leaving behind nothing but the faint echo of their picks against stone. When rescuers descended days later, they found the tunnels twisted, as if the earth itself had shifted to hide something it didn't want found. No bodies, no tools, just the sound of distant breathing from somewhere in the dark. Tonight, we reopen the mine. We'll trace the last steps of those men and uncover why the locals still refuse to go near the mouth of Black Hollow, even a century later. Before we go any deeper, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. This journey won't be easy to forget. And tell me, where in the world are you watching from tonight? Because the story you're about to hear has never truly ended. February 14th, 1922, 2:47 in the morning. The signal rope connecting 43 men to the surface of the Harlan County No. 9 coal mine went slack. The night foreman pulled, hand over hand. 800 feet of hemp cable came up through the wheel housing, and at the end of that rope, which should have been attached to the cage that carried those men down into the earth, there was only a glove, still warm, the finger still curved, as though gripping something in the darkness. But the hand that wore it, gone. The leather at the wrist wasn't torn. It was cut, clean, surgical, as if someone or something had taken great care to separate flesh from fabric without damaging the material. When they finally got the emergency crew down into the shaft 6 hours later, they found 7 men. 7 out of 43, huddled in the main tunnel, 300 feet from the elevator shaft. Not speaking, not moving, just staring at the walls with eyes that had seen something no electric lamp could ever illuminate. The mining company sealed the entrance within 48 hours. No federal investigation, no inquiry. Just dynamite and concrete in a single line in the county records. Structural failure, closed indefinitely. But here's what they didn't bury. Here's what still surfaces in the archived testimonies, in the medical reports, in the photographs taken before the company men arrived with their explosives and their money and their threats. Those 7 survivors, they brought something back with them. Something that didn't show up in any photograph. Something that didn't leave footprints in the snow outside the mine entrance. But something that, over the next 3 weeks, would visit each of them in their homes, behind locked doors, with their families sleeping in the next room. This is the story of what happened in the deep tunnels beneath Harlan County. This is the story they tried to bury deeper than any coal seam. And this is the story that, even now, 103 years later, still whispers from the sealed entrance of mine No. 9. Before we descend into what happened that night, ask yourself this question. If you were 300 feet underground, surrounded by men you'd worked beside for years, and you heard something moving in the darkness beyond your lamplight, something that breathed wrong, that moved wrong, that called to you in the voice of someone you watched die an hour before, would you investigate? Or would you run? And if you ran, where would you run to when every tunnel looks the same in the dark? And every shadow might be the last thing you ever see. Keep that question in mind, because by the end of this story, you'll understand why those 7 men stopped running, why they just stood there, waiting for the rescue that came 6 hours too late, and why perhaps, It would have been better if that rescue had never come at all. Harlan County, Kentucky, winter of 1922. The coal boom was in full surge. Appalachian mines were producing more black diamonds than anywhere else in America, and the money flowed like the Cumberland River in spring thaw. But that money came at a cost, measured in crushed fingers, black lung, and bodies that never came home. The number 9 mine was 3 years old, a deep shaft operation that cut straight down into the mountain like a needle into flesh, then spread out in a network of tunnels that followed the coal seams wherever they led. 800 feet down, 23 separate tunnels, 4 miles of underground passages, all lit by carbide lamps that cast more shadow than light. The men who worked there were the same men who worked every mine in Harlan County. Fathers, sons, immigrants from Poland and Italy, who spoke broken English but understood the universal language of a pickaxe biting into stone. They worked 12-hour shifts in darkness so complete that your lamp became your entire world. Beyond that circle of light, 3 feet, maybe 4 if your carbide was fresh, there was only the sound of other men working, the drip of water from above, and the constant groan of the mountain settling around you. James Calloway ran the night crew, 47 years old, 18 years in the mines. A man who could read a coal seam like scripture and knew the sound of bad timber before it cracked. He'd survived 2 cave-ins and pulled 6 men out of a flooded tunnel in 1919. The kind of foreman who went down first and came up last, and who the men trusted because he'd earned that trust in blood and broken ribs. Thomas Webb was 19, 3 months in the mine. His daughter had been born 6 weeks earlier, and he was working double shifts to pay the doctor's bill and buy a crib that didn't come from the company store. He was paired with Marcus Dulane, a 23-year veteran who'd promised Thomas's mother he'd keep the boy safe. Marcus had kept that promise for 87 days. February 14th would be day 88. And then there was Dr. Emmett Patterson. Not a real doctor, no medical degree, just a company man with a leather bag full of bandages and morphine. His job was to keep the men working, patch them up enough to finish their shifts. But Patterson had been a field medic in the Great War. He'd seen things in the trenches outside Verdun that gave him a particular understanding of what terror looked like on a human face. That understanding would become critical in the hours ahead. The night shift descended at 8 p.m. on February 13th. 43 men in the cage, tools clanging, lunch pails rattling. Standard rotation, nothing unusual. Except that Abraham Kowalski, who'd worked the number 9 since it opened, refused to board the elevator. Just stood there at the shaft opening, shaking his head. When Calloway pressed him, the old Pole said something in his broken English that the other men would remember later. The mountain is speaking. When mountain speaks, wise man listens. The descent took 4 minutes. 4 minutes of darkness broken only by the carbide lamps attached to 43 helmets, creating a constellation of small stars falling into the earth. The cage rattled and swayed on his cable. Normal. The temperature dropped 20 degrees between the surface and the bottom. Normal. The mountain groaned around them as it always did, settling and shifting under its own weight. Normal. Everything was normal. Except it wasn't. Little things. Details that only became significant later, when the survivors tried to piece together where everything went wrong. The canaries were agitated. Those small yellow birds that miners carried to detect bad air. They were fluttering against their cage bars, chirping in distress before the elevator had even stopped. Canaries don't do that unless something is wrong with the atmosphere. But the men tested the air anyway. It was fine. Oxygen levels normal. No methane. No carbon monoxide. Whatever was disturbing the birds, it wasn't anything a meter could measure. And it was cold. Not the usual cold of deep earth. That constant 50-degree chill that soaks into your bones after a few hours. This was different. Localized. Coming from somewhere in the eastern tunnels, where the newest excavations had been pushing deeper into the mountain. One of the men described it as the kind of cold that comes from an open door in winter, like something was letting the outside in. But there was no outside down there, just more mountain. Calloway split the crew into their standard teams, 5 groups of 8 men, each assigned to different tunnel sections. One group stayed at the main junction as runners. Their job was to move between teams, carrying messages, bringing equipment, maintaining the communications line. Webb and Delane went east, toward Tunnel 17, one of the deeper excavations. Patterson stayed at the main junction with his medical supplies, as he always did. At 8:47 p.m., the first pickaxe bit into coal in Tunnel 12. The shift had officially begun. Standard procedure, standard rotation, nothing unusual. At 9:15 p.m., the men in Tunnel 4 heard sounds coming from Tunnel 8. Pickaxes striking stone, rhythmic, steady. The problem? Tunnel 8 was abandoned. Had been for 2 weeks, since a supporting timber cracked. And the company deemed it unsafe until repairs could be made. Nobody was supposed to be in Tunnel 8. Nobody was in Tunnel 8. But something was swinging a pickaxe down there in the dark. At 9:33 p.m., Marcus Delane's light went out. Just stopped. No warning, no flicker, just darkness. Thomas Webb, working 6 feet away, turned to help him relight it. In the 4 seconds it took Webb to cross that distance, Marcus Delane vanished. Didn't cry out, didn't struggle, didn't make a sound. Webb's lamp illuminated the spot where his partner had been standing. The pickaxe was still embedded in the coal seam. Marcus's lunch pail sat unopened against the wall. His water flask lay on its side, liquid still sloshing. His boot prints in the coal dust led right up to where he'd been working. And then they stopped. Not like he'd walked away. Stopped. Mid-step. The final print showed his full weight on the ball of his foot, heel raised, as though he'd been about to take another step forward. But there was no forward step, no backward step, no step at all. Just boot prints that ended as if Marcus Delane had been plucked straight up into solid stone. Thomas Webb ran back through Tunnel 17, his lamp throwing wild shadows against the walls, his boots hammering against stone. He was screaming Marcus's name, screaming for help, screaming because 19-year-old boys who've only been underground for 3 months don't know yet that screaming in a mine just brings the mountain down on your head. The men in Tunnel 16 heard him. They came running. Calloway came running. Within 5 minutes, there were 12 men in Tunnel 17, lamps creating a sphere of light in the place where Marcus Delane had been working. They searched. Of course they searched. They checked every crack in the walls, every shadow, every possible crevice where a man might have fallen. These were miners. They knew how mountains could swallow you. They knew about hidden shafts and concealed drops in sections of tunnel that weren't on any map. But Tunnel 17 was new. 3 weeks of excavation. Every inch of it had been surveyed, measured, documented. There were no hidden spaces, no places for a 200-pound man to vanish into. His pickaxe was still warm where his hands had gripped it. That detail stuck with them. The tool was still warm. Calloway made the decision to pull everyone back to the main junction. Not to evacuate, not yet, but to regroup, to count heads, to figure out what had happened before panic spread through the crew like bad air. Basic protocol. When something goes wrong, you consolidate. You get everyone together where you can see them. You maintain order. Because panic underground kills more miners than cave-ins. They started back. 12 men, lamps bobbing in a line through the darkness. Webb was in the middle of the group, still muttering Marcus's name, still in shock. They were 70 feet from the main junction when someone realized there should have been 13 men walking. 12 were walking. Someone was missing. They stopped, counted again. Peter Gunderson was gone. He'd been at the back of the line. 3 men swore they'd heard him coughing just moments before. He had the beginning stages of silicosis, that fatal dust that turns lungs to stone, and his cough was distinctive. 2 men had heard his boots scuffing the tunnel floor. But when they turned, when they raised their lamps, there was only empty tunnel behind them. And on the ground, right where he'd been walking, his helmet, chin strap still fastened, as if someone had lifted it straight off his head without unfastening it. Without him, it resisted. That's when the fear took root. Not panic yet. Fear. The kind of fear that comes from understanding that the rules you spent years learning, the rules that keep you alive underground, don't apply anymore. These were men who faced danger every shift. They knew how to shore up bad timber. They knew how to smell gas before it became explosive. They knew how to read the mountain's moods. But this was something else. This was the moment they realized they weren't dealing with a mine accident. They were dealing with something that hunted. Calloway got them back to the main junction. 39 men now. 4 missing, though only 2 disappearances had been witnessed. The other 2 must have vanished from their team in the outer tunnels. But in the confusion, in the darkness, no one had noticed until the count came up short. Patterson tried to organize a proper search party, tried to maintain some kind of order. But order was breaking down fast, because that's when they heard it. Breathing, not human breathing. Too slow, too deep, coming from Tunnel 21, one of the deepest excavations, where no one had been working that night. It wasn't the sound of exertion. It wasn't the sound of someone struggling for air. It was the sound of something breathing deliberately, slowly. The way you breathe when you're listening, when you're waiting, when you're deciding which prey to take next. And beneath that breathing, another sound. Scraping, metal on stone, regular, methodical. Someone, something, was dragging the tool through the darkness, coming closer. Nobody moved. 39 men hardened by years underground, frozen by a sound that shouldn't exist. The breathing continued, that slow, deliberate rhythm. And the scraping grew louder, closer. Metal on stone, but wrong somehow. The pitch was off. Too high for a pickaxe being dragged, too rhythmic for something being dropped or kicked. Calloway made a decision. They would retreat to the elevator shaft. All of them, together. No more splitting up. No more searching. Whatever was happening in these tunnels, they weren't equipped to handle it. They needed to get to the surface, get help, get federal inspectors down here with proper equipment and armed guards and answers that made sense. But getting to the elevator meant crossing through the main junction, meant exposing themselves in the one large chamber where lamplight couldn't reach the walls, where the darkness pressed in from all sides, where anything could circle around them, stay just beyond the light, and pick them off one by one. They moved as a group, tight formation, lamps pointed outward, tools raised. Not that tools would help. They all knew that by now. But human hands need something to hold when fear takes over. Patterson led the group. Calloway brought up the rear. Webb stayed in the middle, still muttering, still lost in the shock of watching his partner disappear. They made it halfway across the junction when the sounds changed. The breathing stopped, just cut off mid-exhale. And in that sudden silence, they heard something worse. Footsteps, but not the boot fall of miners. Bare feet on stone, multiple sets, moving fast, circling. The lamps began failing, not all at once, one at a time, starting with the outermost lights. Men would be walking, lights shining steady, and then darkness. Flame extinguished as if someone had covered the lamp with their hand. But there were no hands, no one close enough to touch. Just darkness spreading inward like water rising in a sinking ship. That's when the voices started. Marcus Dulane's voice calling from Tunnel 8. Thomas, I'm hurt, help me. Webb lurched toward the sound. 3 men had to grab him, hold him back because they all knew that Marcus wasn't calling. Marcus was gone, and whatever was calling in his voice wanted Thomas to follow into the darkness. Then Peter Gunderson's voice from Tunnel 12, asking for water, saying he'd gotten turned around, saying he couldn't find his way back. 2 more men started moving toward the sound before Calloway roared at them to stop, to stay together, to ignore the voices. But how do you ignore the voice of a man you worked beside for 5 years? How do you ignore a friend calling for help? The answer is, you can't, not entirely. And whatever was using those voices knew it. 3 men broke formation, ran toward the voices of their friends, disappeared into the tunnels, gone in seconds. The rest of the group could hear them calling out, asking if anyone could hear them, saying they'd found something, saying. The voices cut off, all 3 of them, mid-sentence. And then those same voices started calling from different tunnels, fresh, unworried, asking the others to follow. By the time they reached the elevator shaft, there were 30 men left. 9 had vanished. Not over hours, over 15 minutes. 15 minutes to lose 9 men in darkness that was supposed to be empty. The elevator wasn't coming. The rope had been severed 800 feet up where the cage should have been waiting at the surface. Something had cut through hemp cable thick enough to hold 3 tons of equipment. Clean cut, not frayed, not snapped from weight. Cut. And all that remained was a glove that had belonged to the night foreman on the surface. A man named Douglas Keene, who'd been standing at the wheel housing when the rope went slack. Nobody would find out what happened to Douglas Keene until morning. Nobody would find out about the 4 other men who'd been on the surface that night. But down in the main junction, surrounded by darkness, and voices that shouldn't exist, the 30 remaining miners understood one critical fact. They weren't getting out the way they came in. There were emergency exits, Every deep mine had them. Ventilation shafts with ladders, auxiliary tunnels that connected to neighboring mine systems. But those exits were half a mile deeper into the mountain. Getting to them meant going through tunnels where things with bare feet walked in the darkness, where your friends' voices called from empty spaces, where lamplight died without reason. Dr. Patterson made a suggestion. There was a storage chamber in Tunnel 14, old section, first excavation. It had heavy timber doors that could be barred from inside. They could fortify, wait for rescue. Someone on the surface would realize something was wrong when the shift didn't report in. Help would come. But Calloway knew better. He'd been mining long enough to understand that help didn't come quickly for men underground. The company's first priority would be securing the surface, making sure the problem, whatever it was, stayed contained. They'd seal the mine first, ask questions later. Standard procedure when something went wrong enough to cut the elevator cable. Still, the storage chamber offered something the open junction didn't. Walls, a defendable position, a way to put something solid between them and whatever was hunting them. They moved toward Tunnel 14. 28 men now. 2 more had vanished during the discussion, simply ceased to be part of the group without anyone noticing when or how. The storage chamber door was open. That should have been the first warning. It was supposed to be locked. Company protocol, tools and explosives stored inside. Only supervisors had keys. But it was open, hanging on its hinges. The timber was scratched. Long gouges in the wood, made by something that had clawed at it from the inside. Inside the chamber, Patterson's lamp illuminated something that made the previous hours make terrible sense. On the wall, someone had mounted a plaque. Brass, tarnished with age. It read, Harlan County Mine Number 3, closed by order of State Inspector, April 17th, 1897, due to catastrophic loss of life. This wasn't Number 9, not entirely. Number 9 had been built directly over Number 3, the same shaft, the same tunnels, just extended deeper. And Number 3 had been sealed after 13 men died, under circumstances the official report described only as highly irregular death circumstances, requiring permanent closure. Patterson pulled down a folder from a shelf. Company records. The kind that weren't supposed to exist. The kind that documented what actually happened, not what the public was told. He read by lamplight while 27 men gathered around, while something scratched at the door they'd barred behind them. April 12th, 1897. Night shift at mine number 3. 17 men underground. They broke through into an unmapped chamber. Natural formation. Cathedral-sized space that shouldn't have existed in that part of the mountain. The shift foreman described it as a hollow place that predated the coal seam by millennia. They found markings on the walls, not graffiti, not mine notation, pictographs. Old, depicting figures that weren't quite human descending into the earth. And bones. So many bones. Animal bones at first. Then, as they explored deeper into that hollow space, bones that were too large to be animal, too shaped to be entirely human. 4 men disappeared during that first shift. The company sent rescue teams. 10 more men went down. 7 came back. Those 7 described hearing breathing in the cathedral space. Described finding their missing friends wandering in the darkness. Except their friends didn't respond to their names. Didn't seem to recognize them. would only stare with eyes that reflected lamplight like an animal's eyes. When the rescuers tried to bring those men back up, the missing miners attacked. Not with tools, with teeth and nails. Like they'd forgotten they'd ever been human. The company's solution? Dynamite the cathedral chamber. Seal it off. Bring up whoever could be saved and declare the mine too unstable for continued operation. 13 men never made it out. And for 25 years, the company let everyone believe that mine number 3 was just another cave-in. Just another tragedy in an industry built on tragedy. Until 1920, when someone decided that the coal seam below that sealed chamber was too valuable to abandon. So they opened a new mine, number 9. Drove the shaft down through the exact same mountain. And somewhere during the excavation, somewhere in one of those 23 tunnels, they'd broken through, opened the seal, let whatever had been trapped in that hollow place for 2.5 decades out into the mine. Let it climb up through the darkness toward 43 men who had no idea they were working above a mass grave. Patterson closed the folder, looked at Calloway, said something that would appear later in the official testimony. We didn't uncover anything down here. We uncovered what was already waiting. We just gave it new tunnels to hunt in. The scratching at the door stopped at 10:47 p.m. Just ceased mid-scrape, as if whatever was outside had gotten bored, or had realized there were easier ways to get to the men inside. The silence was somehow worse than the noise. Because silence in a mine means something is listening, waiting, choosing its moment. Calloway organized the men into a defensive perimeter inside the storage chamber. Backs to the walls. Lamps creating an island of light in the center. Tools ready. Though everyone knew tools were useless by now. Patterson distributed the last of his morphine to the men who were starting to break. The ones muttering to themselves. The ones whose hands shook too much to hold their pickaxes steady. Field medicine from the war. Keep the unit combat effective as long as possible. Deal with trauma. After survival is secured, that's when they noticed the ventilation grate, high up on the western wall, 12 inches by 18 inches, covered in mesh screen, standard issue for air circulation in storage chambers. And behind that screen, something was moving. They could see it through the mesh, pale, shifting, watching them with eyes that reflected the lamplight. Multiple sets of eyes, crammed into that impossible small space. There shouldn't have been room for even one person behind that grate. But there were several somethings behind it. Compressed, wrong, patient. One of the men, Albert Thomas, a father of 4 who'd worked mines for 16 years. He stared at those eyes and said something that would haunt the survivors. He said, "That's where Marcus is. That's where all of them are. They're in the walls. They've been in the walls the whole time, watching us, waiting for us to split up." The eyes blinked, slowly, in unison, and then withdrew deeper into the ventilation shaft, leaving only darkness. The door exploded inward at 11:03 p.m. Not breached, not broken down. The timber bar splintered from the center outward, as if something had struck it with impossible force from both sides simultaneously. The door hung on its hinges for a moment, then fell, and the lamps began dying, one after another, faster this time, like candles being blown out by an invisible wind. The defensive perimeter collapsed. 28 men pressed backward against the rear wall of the chamber, watching the sphere of light shrink, watching the darkness advance like a living thing. In the shrinking light, they saw them. Not clearly, never clearly, but enough. Shapes that had once been men. Shapes that remember being men. They moved wrong. Joints bending in directions joints shouldn't bend. They breathed wrong. That slow, deliberate rhythm they'd heard earlier. Like something remembering how lungs worked, but not quite getting it right. And their skin, in the brief flashes of dying lamplight, their skin looked wet, translucent, as if they'd been underground so long that everything human had started dissolving away, leaving only the parts that could survive in absolute darkness. The attack wasn't frenzied. That would have been merciful. It was methodical, strategic. The things that had been miners knew how miners thought, knew that men underground instinctively protect their light source. So they targeted the lamps, came at them from angles that forced the defenders to choose between maintaining their defensive line or protecting their ability to see. And in the chaos of trying to do both, the perimeter broke. Men were pulled backward into the darkness, not dragged, pulled, lifted off their feet with strength that shouldn't exist, yanked upward into ventilation shafts too small for a human body to fit through, but fitting them through anyway. The sounds of that fitting process, bones compressing, flesh tearing, those sounds would echo in the survivors' memories until the day they died. Thomas Webb saw one of them clearly, just for a moment, in the last bright flare of a carbide lamp before it died. He saw Peter Gunderson, or what had been Peter Gunderson 2 hours ago. The body was Gunderson's. The clothes were Gunderson's. But the thing inside that body wasn't. It moved like something operating a mechanism it didn't fully understand. Like something learning how to be human by wearing one. And its eyes, Webb would describe them later as empty. Not in the way a dead man's eyes are empty, but in the way a window is empty. When there's nothing but darkness on the other side. Gunderson's mouth opened, and Marcus Dulane's voice came out, asking Thomas to come closer, saying he needed help, saying his daughter's name, saying things only Marcus would know. The thing wearing Gunderson's body knew everything Marcus had known, because it had been wearing Marcus earlier, before Marcus stopped being useful. Webb didn't go to it, couldn't, was physically held back by two other miners who understood that whatever was calling to him wasn't his friend anymore. The thing that had been Gunderson tilted its head, paused, then smiled with Marcus's smile, and retreated back into the darkness to hunt someone more willing to follow. Calloway made the call that saved the survivors. He stopped trying to fight, stopped trying to defend, just screamed at everyone to run. Run for the elevator shaft. Run through whatever was between them and that shaft. Run, and don't stop running even when you hear your friends calling behind you. 17 men made it out of the storage chamber. 11 didn't. The ones who didn't weren't necessarily the slowest. They were the ones who hesitated. The ones who looked back when they heard familiar voices. The ones who paused for just a second to help someone who'd fallen. Because the things in the darkness understood mercy, understood loyalty, and used those human instincts as weapons. The run through the main junction was chaos. Impossible to document, impossible to map. What the survivors remembered was contradictory. Some said they ran for 5 minutes. Others swore it was 30. Some remembered taking Tunnel 9 to reach the shaft. Others were certain they'd gone through Tunnel 12. But all of them remembered the same detail. They weren't just running from something. They were being herded, driven, pushed toward a specific location by things that blocked certain passages and left others open. Things that could have caught them at any moment but chose not to. Because catching them wasn't the point. Leading them somewhere was the point. The elevator shaft was empty when they reached it. 15 men now. 2 more had vanished during the run without anyone noticing exactly when. The metal cage that should have been at the bottom of the shaft wasn't there. And when they looked up, aiming the 6 remaining lamps toward the surface 800 feet above, they saw why. The cage was halfway up, suspended, empty, swaying slightly on a cable that had been spliced together. Someone had reattached the severed rope, lowered the cage partway down, then stopped, left it dangling in the middle of the shaft, just out of reach, close enough to see, too far to access. A taunt, a message. Whoever, whatever, had cut the cable on the surface and taken Douglas Keene and his crew. It wanted the miners to know. There was no rescue coming. There was no escape. There was only the mountain, and what lived in it. Patterson looked at the shaft walls, looked at the steel maintenance ladder bolted into the stone. Emergency protocol. Every deep mine had them. Ladder rungs every 2 feet, climbing 800 feet straight up to the surface. An impossible climb. A desperate climb. But the only option left. Calloway went first. Then 4 others. Strong climbers. Men who'd worked construction before the mines. They made it 50 feet up before the lights went out. All 6 lamps. Simultaneously. Plunging the shaft into darkness so complete that the men on the ladder couldn't see the rung 6 inches in front of their faces. In that darkness, something climbed up after them. Fast. Impossibly fast. Moving on the ladder without making the metal creak, without disturbing the air, without any sound except that slow breathing they'd heard in the tunnels. And one by one, the climbers above began to scream. Brief. Cut short, followed by the wet sound of bodies hitting stone 800 feet below. When the lamps came back on, flickering back to life as if they'd never gone out, the ladder was empty. All 5 men gone. And on the bottom of the shaft, where the bodies should have been, there was nothing. Just smooth stone, as if the mountain had swallowed them before they landed. There are moments in extreme situations where the human mind simply stops processing options, stops considering outcomes, stops doing anything except finding a way to survive the next 60 seconds. For the 10 men at the bottom of that shaft, this was that moment. The ladder had killed 5 men. The tunnels behind them were full of things that used to be their friends. The cage was unreachable, and something was breathing in the darkness just beyond their lamplight. Calloway made a choice that shouldn't have worked. A choice born from 18 years of mining experience, and the understanding that mountains have rules, even when everything else has stopped making sense. He looked at the shaft wall, looked at the support beams that bracketed the elevator housing, looked at the cable that had been spliced together and left dangling. And he said something that would be recorded in Patterson's testimony. Mountains don't kill you. Mountains just are. It's what lives in them that kills you. And what lives in them still has to obey gravity. He organized the remaining men into a desperate plan. They would climb the cable, not the ladder where the things could follow easily. The cable, hand over hand, 800 feet of rope that had already been cut once, that had been spliced by whatever had taken the surface crew, that might be deliberately weakened to fail at any moment. But it was rope. And rope, unlike ladders, could be climbed quickly. Could be climbed without creating the rhythmic metallic sound that would alert everything in the tunnels that men were escaping. Patterson went first this time. Medical officer, lightest man. If the cable would hold anyone, it would hold him. He wrapped his hands in cloth torn from his shirt, gripped the hemp, and began climbing, hand over hand, using a technique he'd learned scaling rope obstacles in basic training, using muscles that hadn't done this kind of work in 7 years, using willpower that came from knowing that stopping meant dying, in a way that would make the trenches at Verdun look merciful. He made it 100 feet before the others started following. Calloway insisted on spacing, 6 feet between each climber, to distribute the weight, to prevent the rope from snapping if it hit maximum load. Basic physics, basic survival math, the kind of calculations miners make every day when deciding how much dynamite is too much or whether a timber will hold. Webb was fourth in line, still muttering, still in shock. But his hands worked automatically, muscle memory from 3 months of wielding pickaxes, taking over where conscious thought had stopped functioning. Above him, 3 men climbed. Below him, 6 more waited their turn. And in the tunnels behind them, the breathing sounds multiplied, converged, as if everything that had been spread throughout the mine system was gathering at the shaft, as if it knew this was the final moment, the last chance to stop the prey from escaping. At 200 feet, the lights began dying again. But this time, the men had anticipated it, had their lamps covered, had backup matches, had learned that light wasn't safety. Light was just visibility. And sometimes being visible was worse than being blind. They climbed in darkness, navigating by touch, by the burn in the shoulders and forearms, by counting hand grips the way you count prayers, by focusing on the rope above them and refusing to think about the 800-foot drop below or what was climbing up after them. Because things were climbing after them, they could feel it, feel the rope vibrating in ways that had nothing to do with the men above, feel movement below that was too fast, too confident, feel breath on their ankles that wasn't wind from the shaft. At 400 feet, Albert Thomas, the man who'd said the missing miners were in the walls, he stopped climbing, just froze. The man below him, John Krebs, called up asking what was wrong. Thomas didn't answer, just held onto the rope, motionless, for 5 seconds, 10. Then his hands released. He fell, not screaming, not struggling, just let go, as if something had whispered to him that letting go would be easier, that the fall would be faster than what was waiting at the top. That 400 feet of empty air was merciful compared to what came next. His body never hit bottom. They heard it fall, heard the air whistling past him as he dropped, but no impact, just silence, as if the mountain had opened its mouth and swallowed him mid-fall. 9 men kept climbing. At 600 feet, the rope started moving. Not from the climber's weight, moving laterally, swinging. Something at the bottom of the shaft was pulling it, yanking it, trying to shake the men loose like fruit from a tree. The hemp creaked, groaned. The splice joint, where the 2 pieces had been tied together, began to separate, strand by strand, fiber by fiber, making a sound like tearing fabric. Calloway, now bringing up the rear after letting the others pass him, made a decision. He pulled out his folding knife, the one every miner carried, and he cut the rope beneath him. severed it clean, sent the bottom 100 feet of cable plummeting into the darkness, and whatever had been pulling on it. The swinging stopped, but now they were climbing on a rope that ended in empty air. A rope that was no longer connected to anything below. A rope whose only anchor was the cage above, and whatever mechanism was holding that cage in place. A cage that was already dangling freely in the middle of the shaft. That might not support the weight of 8 men pulling themselves up toward it. At 700 feet, Patterson reached the cage, pulled himself over the metal railing, felt the structure shift under his weight. The cage wasn't locked into position. It was just resting on the cable, balanced. One wrong move and it would slide back down the shaft, taking everyone still on the rope with it. He signaled the others to stop climbing, to hold position, to wait while he figured out how to secure the cage. But there was no mechanism to secure it, no brake system, no safety lock. Whoever had left it here had left it deliberately unstable. A final test, a final choice. Climb up and maybe bring the whole thing crashing down, or stay where you were and wait for what was climbing up behind you. The choice was made for them. Something grabbed John Krebs, third from the bottom, and pulled. Hard. Krebs screamed, held onto the rope, held on with grip strength born from years of mining. Held on while something below tried to tear him off. His hand started bleeding. The hemp cut into his palms as it slid through his grip. The men above him could hear his bones creaking, could hear him begging God, or the mountain or whatever was listening to let him hold on just a few seconds more. The man above Krebs, Samuel Tate, he reached down, grabbed Krebs's wrist, held him. 2 men's grip against whatever was below. And for a moment, for 5 impossible seconds, it seemed like it might be enough. Then Tate was pulled off the rope too. Both men, gone. Fell together into the darkness below, still holding on to each other. Still human enough in their final moment to refuse to let go. 7 men reached the cage. They didn't try to secure it, didn't try to stabilize it. They just climbed past it, kept going. Climbed the last 100 feet to the surface using the cage's top railing as a ladder. Using the cable, housing, using anything they could grip while the cage swayed beneath them, threatening to fall, threatening to take them all down if any of them slipped. Patterson reached the surface at 1:15 a.m., pulled himself over the wheel housing, and collapsed on the frozen ground. The 6 others followed. Webb came up last, still muttering Marcus's name, still covered in coal dust and blood, and the darkness of everything that had happened below. They lay there in the snow. February snow. Kentucky winter. Coldest night in a month. And none of them had ever been so grateful for cold air, for stars, for the absolute absence of stone walls, and lamplight, and breathing sounds that didn't belong to anything human. Behind them, the wheel housing groaned. The cable snapped. And 800 feet below, the cage fell. They heard it hit bottom, heard the metal crunch and tear, heard the sound of something that might have been screaming, or might have been the mountain settling. Then silence. The mine entrance was 50 feet away. The head frame, the surface buildings, the office where Douglas King should have been monitoring the shift, where the night crew should have been waiting with coffee and cigarettes and questions about why the signal rope had gone slack. But the office was empty. The windows were broken, and on the ground outside the door in melting snow, there were boot prints. dozens of them, made by bare feet, leading from the mine entrance toward the tree line, toward the Appalachian wilderness that surrounded the mine for 30 miles in every direction. 7 men. That's what came back from mine number 9 that night. 7 men out of 43 who descended at 8 p.m. and 5 men from the surface crew that had never been underground at all. 12 people missing. No bodies, no evidence. Just empty buildings and broken windows and footprints that led into darkness of a different kind. The survivors walked, not ran, walked. 3 miles through snow to the nearest mine office with a working telephone. 3 miles of looking behind them every few steps. 3 miles of listening for footsteps that might not be human. 3 miles of trying to understand why they were being allowed to leave. Because that's what it felt like. Not escape. Permission. Patterson made the call at 4:47 a.m. State Mining Board, federal inspectors, county sheriff, everyone with authority to respond to a mine disaster. He used words like catastrophic loss of life, an immediate evacuation, and unprecedented circumstances. He was careful not to use words like hunting, or transformed, or still down there, because those words would get him committed to an asylum before anyone took action. The response came at dawn. 20 federal marshals, 12 state mine inspectors, a full company of National Guard troops called up from Fort Knox. They arrived with electric lights and rifles and geologists and every piece of equipment designed to handle mine disasters. They were prepared for cave-ins, for fires, for gas leaks, for flooded tunnels. They were not prepared for what they found. The mine was empty. Not collapsed, not flooded. Empty. They went down with armed guards and electric searchlights bright enough to illuminate entire tunnel sections. They mapped every passage, every chamber, every shaft. They found the storage room where Patterson had discovered the company records. They found the broken door, the claw marks. But they didn't find bodies. Didn't find blood. Didn't find any physical evidence that 43 men had been working there 11 hours earlier. The tools were gone. The lunch pails were gone. Even the coal dust, the accumulated residue from 3 years of excavation, looked disturbed, swept clean, as if something had erased every trace of human presence. They found one thing. Deep in Tunnel 21, at the absolute farthest point of the excavation, they found the breach. The place where number 9 had broken through into the sealed chamber from mine number 3. A hole in the wall, roughly 8 feet in diameter. Beyond it, darkness. The kind of darkness that electric lights don't penetrate. The kind of darkness that seems to absorb illumination rather than reflect it. The lead inspector ordered the breach sealed immediately. No investigation of what lay beyond. No recovery mission. Just 20 tons of concrete pumped into that hole until it was filled solid. Then a steel plate bolted over it. Then the entire tunnel section dynamited. Then the mine entrance sealed with more concrete. Then, and this is in the official record, the entire property purchased by a federal shell company and declared off limits for perpetual duration. 48 hours. That's how long it took to erase mine number 9 from existence. Faster than any government agency had ever moved before, or since. The 7 survivors were interviewed, separately, by federal agents who asked very specific questions and took extensive notes and never once asked about the impossible things. They asked about gas levels, about structural integrity, about company safety protocols. They never asked about breathing sounds, never asked about voices in the darkness, never asked why 7 men had to climb a rope in the dark, while things that used to be their co-workers hunted them. Each survivor told a different story, not because they were lying, because human memory doesn't work properly after trauma, because each man had seen different parts of what happened, because their minds were trying to make sense of events that had no rational explanation. Patterson's testimony mentioned unexplained disappearances and equipment failures. Webb's testimony was mostly incoherent, focused on Marcus Dulane and needing to find him. Calloway's testimony was the most detailed, but even he couldn't explain how 43 men had vanished over the course of 4 hours without any physical trace remaining. The official report listed the cause as structural collapse resulting in catastrophic loss of life with 0 recoverable remains due to complete tunnel system failure. It was filed, sealed, and marked classified for 75 years. The families were paid, quietly, far more than standard mining death compensation. Each widow, each parent, each child received enough money to leave Harlan County, to relocate, to never speak about what happened. Most of them took the money. A few refused. But even the ones who refused eventually left. Because staying meant living 3 miles from a sealed mine entrance. Meant walking past it every day. Meant hearing sounds at night that might have been wind through the trees. Or might have been something else. The 5 surface crew members were never found. Their families received the same compensation, the same instructions to leave. Douglas Keene's wife reported hearing him calling from outside her house 2 weeks after the mine was sealed. His voice asking to be let in, saying he was cold, saying he just wanted to come home. She didn't open the door. She left Kentucky the next morning and never returned. And the 7 survivors, 2 of them vanished within 10 days. Just disappeared. No bodies, no evidence, no explanation. Their families found their homes empty, doors locked from the inside. No signs of struggle, just empty houses that smelled like coal dust and deep earth. A 3rd survivor, Michael Royce, was found dead in his bedroom 3 weeks later. Door locked, windows closed. His body positioned on the floor as if he'd been trying to dig through the wood. His fingernails torn off. His fingers worn to bone from scratching. The coroner ruled it death by exhaustion. Didn't explain what he'd been trying to reach. Didn't explain why a man would scratch through 6 inches of hardwood when there was a door 10 feet away. Thomas Webb lived 2 more years. Spent them in and out of psychiatric facilities. Spent them muttering about Marcus Dulane, about needing to go back down, about hearing his friend calling from inside the walls of his room. He died in 1924. Official cause, suicide. But the orderly who found him reported that Webb's body was positioned wrong, facing the wall, hands pressed against the stone as if he'd been trying to push through, as if he'd been answering a call that only he could hear. The 4 remaining survivors lived longer, but they never spoke about that night again. Not to journalists, not to investigators, not to family. Patterson moved to California and became a real doctor. Never practiced underground medicine again. Never returned to Kentucky. His medical records show he slept with every light in his house on, until the day he died in 1963. Calloway worked in surface mining for another decade, but refused to go underground. Ever, for any reason. Turned down positions that would have tripled his salary. When asked why, he said, "I already went as deep as any man should go. I saw what's down there, and what's down there should stay down there." The last survivor died in 1981. Took the full story with him. Took whatever he'd seen in those tunnels that the others hadn't. Took the knowledge of what was still sealed beneath hundreds of tons of concrete in a mountain in eastern Kentucky. Mine number 9 has been closed for 103 years. The land has changed ownership 17 times. Every owner has reported the same things. Strange sounds at night. Equipment malfunctions near the sealed entrance. Workers refusing to operate machinery within 100 yards of where the mine used to be. And footprints. Bare footprints in mud and snow. Appearing overnight. Leading from the sealed entrance toward the surrounding forest. Then disappearing. In 2003, a geological survey team used ground-penetrating radar to map the sealed tunnels. They detected empty spaces, large chambers that shouldn't exist according to the original mine plans, and movement. The radar showed movement in those chambers. Something large. Something that appeared on the readings for 3 seconds, then vanished. The team's lead geologist requested immediate evacuation. Refused to continue the survey. His final report recommended the entire area be designated a federal exclusion zone. The recommendation was approved. The land is now off limits, permanently. The official reason given: unstable geological formations presenting extreme danger of sudden collapse. The unofficial reason lives in a classified file. Lives and testimonies that were sealed for 75 years, and then sealed for another 75 when the first period expired. Lives in the memories of 7 men who climbed out of hell and never fully came back. The Harlan County Mining Company ceased operations in 1923. Officially, the decision was financial. The loss of mine number 9, the federal investigation, the compensation payments. The company declared bankruptcy and dissolved. But the dissolution came with peculiar conditions. The company's assets were purchased by a holding corporation that had no public shareholders, no board of directors, no corporate address, except a registered agent in Washington, D.C. The kind of corporation that appears only in classified government documents. That corporation maintained ownership of the number 9 property for 80 years, paid property taxes, paid for security, paid to keep the land undeveloped and undisturbed, never extracted another pound of coal from beneath Harlan County, just maintained the seal, inspected it annually, reinforced the concrete when weather erosion required it. In the decades following 1922, there were 17 separate attempts to reopen mining operations in the area. Different companies, different investors, different proposals. Every single one was denied permits. Not by the state mining board, not by county authorities, by federal agencies, the Bureau of Mines, the Department of Interior, in 3 cases, the Department of Defense. No. Explanations given, just denials, permanent and non-negotiable. Local historians documented something interesting. Between 1922 and 1950, 47 people went missing in the forest surrounding the former mine number 9 property. Hikers, hunters, a geological survey team in 1937, a group of teenagers exploring abandoned mine works in 1945. None of them were ever found. Search parties were sent. Professional trackers, state police, federal agents in some cases. They found the same things every time. Tracks leading toward the sealed mine entrance, then stopping, just ending mid-trail, as if the missing persons had been lifted straight up off the ground or pulled straight down into it. After 1950, the missing persons report stopped. Not because people stopped disappearing, because people stopped going into those woods. Local knowledge became clear. You don't go near the old number 9. You don't hike that ridge. You don't hunt that valley. The reasons given were vague. Bad ground, unstable tunnels, dangerous wildlife. But everyone who'd grown up in Harlan County knew the real reason. They'd heard the stories from their grandparents, from the families of the 43 miners who never came home, from the survivors who'd muttered warnings before they died or disappeared. The mountain remembers, and what lives in the mountain doesn't forget. In 1997, a documentary crew from the History Channel obtained permits to film near the exclusion zone. They weren't allowed on the actual property. Federal law prevented that. But they interviewed local residents, recorded oral histories, gathered testimonies from descendants of the survivors and the missing miners. The footage was compelling, disturbing, ready for broadcast. The episode never aired. The production company received a cease and desist from a law firm representing national security interests. The raw footage was confiscated, every copy destroyed. The producer tried to fight it, filed Freedom of Information requests, contacted journalists. 3 months later, his case was dismissed without explanation. He was offered a settlement package on the condition that he never speak about the project again. He took the settlement, moved to Oregon, refused all subsequent interview requests. The last official government presence at the site was 2008. A team from the Geological Survey conducted seismic testing across Appalachia, mapping underground formations.